Everyone knows Joan of Arc, the teenage saint who heard voices, wore armor, and led armies. But here's the thing, most of what you know is wrong. This isn't a Disney warrior princess story. This is a bureaucratic fever dream where politics, paranoia, and puberty collide in medieval France. A girl claims God is on speed dial and somehow ends up in charge of the French army, only to be torched for listening too well. History calls her a saint. Her enemies called her annoying. And in the end, both were right. Welcome to France, circa 1400-something, a time when quality of life meant you probably hadn't died of dysentery yet. The 100 Years' War was less of a war and more of a century-long tantrum between England and France, each convinced they were the rightful owner of a particularly soggy piece of real estate. Think of it like a medieval custody battle, but instead of lawyers, they had knights, plague, and chronic mud. The French countryside was basically one big, damp battlefield. Fields that once grew wheat now grew corpses. Cities crumbled, famine spread, and hope was taking a very long sabbatical. Picture peasants trudging through gray fog, muttering about taxes, and occasionally getting trampled by someone's horse. Even the cows looked depressed. And then there was Charles VII, technically the King of France, but practically the king of nothing. Imagine being a monarch whose entire job description is waiting for a miracle. Charles wasn't crowned yet. He was hiding out in a chateau somewhere along the Loire River, surrounded by courtiers who were equal parts terrified and useless. His court had all the energy of a doomed startup right before bankruptcy. France was fractured, literally. Half the country answered to the English, the other half to the Burgundians, and the rest just tried not to die before supper. Every castle was a potential enemy. Every priest had a different opinion about which king God actually liked better. Spoiler: God had probably stopped checking his mail by then. But amid the chaos, somewhere in the damp, cow-scented village of Domremy, a teenage girl was quietly being forged by boredom, belief, and an almost supernatural level of confidence. We'll get to her. For now, let's linger in the misery. It deserves a moment of appreciation, because to understand how bizarre Joan's story was, you need to understand how broken this world was. The church preached divine order, but reality looked like a badly managed group project. The English claimed God wanted them to rule France. The French claimed God wanted them to kick the English out. God, meanwhile, remained politely silent, leaving everyone to stab each other in the name of faith. And through all this, rumors started spreading. Whispers of prophecy. Legends about a maid, a virgin girl who would save France. Every village had their own version, usually told after too much wine and not enough bread. Most people dismissed it as folklore, the kind of bedtime story told to make hopeless times feel slightly less hopeless. But then, as often happens in history, the universe decided to get dramatic. Let's set the mood. Winter of 1428. The French army is demoralized. The English are advancing, and Charles VII, that soggy monarch in waiting, is quietly panicking in his gilded corner. The man's claim to the throne is so flimsy it could double as parchment. His mother literally told everyone he was illegitimate. Imagine that level of maternal support. He needed a miracle, but miracles were in short supply, unless, of course, one wandered in wearing peasant clothes. Enter Jeanne d'Arc, but before she arrives, let's pause for perspective. Imagine you're a French soldier in 1428. You've survived plague, bad soup, and 3 decades of losing. Then someone tells you a teenage girl from nowhere says God told her to fix everything. Would you believe her? No. You'd laugh, drink, and go back to pretending not to die. And that's exactly what most people did. Because Joan's arrival in history didn't look like destiny. It looked like delusion. Still, before she even showed up at court, the stage was set for her to exist. Desperation makes people see divine patterns in muddy footprints. When your king is weak and your priests are contradictory, anyone claiming to have clarity sounds like a prophet, especially if she's young, confident, and terrifyingly sincere. Meanwhile, the French leadership wasn't exactly inspiring. Charles VII's advisors were the medieval version of corporate middle managers, excellent at meetings, terrible at results. They argued endlessly over alliances while England kept winning. Taxes rose, morale fell, and peasants began whispering that maybe God had abandoned France altogether. And honestly, who could blame him? The country was a mess. Armies looted their own villages, soldiers switched sides for better pay, and the church, the one thing meant to provide moral stability, was knee-deep in corruption and wine. The priests preached humility from marble cathedrals while peasants starved in the mud outside. It's no wonder that when someone claimed to have a message straight from heaven, people listened, even if that someone was an illiterate farm girl. But let's not jump ahead. Before the divine phone calls and battle banners, there was only Domremy, a quiet, muddy village near the border of Burgundy. It's the kind of place where nothing happens for centuries, until suddenly everything does. Joan grew up there, helping her family farm and occasionally dodging raiders. Her childhood was unremarkable, except for the part where she kept telling people God had plans for her. And, crucially, she believed it. But again, we'll get to her voices later. Right now, what matters is timing. France was spiritually exhausted. The nobility was corrupt, the soldiers were superstitious, and the peasants were desperate for something, anything, to believe in. And belief, as history often proves, is the most explosive weapon of all. So when a young girl said she could hear heaven's orders, people didn't roll their eyes, not for long. Anyway, they squinted, they whispered, and then they wondered, what if she's right? Because what's the alternative? Admit your nation's doomed? No. Humans would rather follow a delusional teenager into battle than face the truth that maybe the universe just doesn't care. That's the real genius of Joan's story. Not her miracles, but her timing. She appeared when France was spiritually on its last breath, and she offered the one thing no one else could: purpose. A reason to believe that suffering meant something. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. The idea of a woman claiming divine authority made theologians twitch like bad Wi-Fi. But at first, they didn't take her seriously enough to panic. To them, she was just another peasant with too much imagination and too little supervision. And yet, there was something about her, something that made people pause mid-laugh, a conviction that felt contagious, the kind of energy you can't fake or exorcise. But before she could prove anything, she'd have to get an audience with the man himself, the uncrowned, unmotivated Charles VII. Convincing him would take more than faith. It would take persistence, charisma, and probably a bit of divine scheduling. Still, that's what makes history fun. It's not built by those who wait politely for permission. It's built by those who show up, declare destiny, and dare everyone else to argue. And Joan of Arc, or as she called herself, Jeanne la Pucelle, was about to walk straight into France's mess and say, "Move, God sent me." They laughed at her, of course. They always do at first, but they wouldn't be laughing for long. Domremy wasn't exactly the kind of place where miracles happened. It was a sleepy patch of farmland wedged between two angry lords and one disinterested priest. The cows outnumbered the books, and the only excitement came when the river flooded or someone got excommunicated by accident. Into this backdrop of mud, superstition, and religious overkill, a girl named Jeanne began hearing things. She was 12, which, in modern terms, is about the age most kids are discovering Wi-Fi, not heavenly messengers. But Jeanne claimed she heard voices, plural, and they weren't the usual intrusive thoughts about chores. These were apparently divine, articulate, and very specific about France's military situation. They told her to be good, go to church, and one day save her country. Which, let's be honest, is a weird life plan to hand to a farm kid. Now, in a world where people thought sneezing was demonic possession, hearing voices wasn't the flex you might think it was. Most villagers reacted somewhere between awe and mild concern. Some whispered that Jeanne was touched by God. Others suggested maybe by something less flattering. Still, there was something unervingly certain about her. She didn't flinch, didn't doubt, didn't even blush when she said angels talked to her. Her main informants, according to her, were Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. Basically heaven's motivational speaker trio. They told her to protect France and to stick up for the rightful king, Charles VII. Imagine being 12, milking cows, and suddenly getting unsolicited divine advice about national politics. That's like your Alexa suddenly announcing you're destined to end a world war. But Jeanne didn't treat it like hallucination. She treated it like homework. She prayed harder, fasted longer, and became something of a village mystery. People who met her said she glowed, not literally, but in that unsettling, "This person knows something I don't" kind of way. She had the intensity of someone who never doubted themselves, which made everyone else deeply uncomfortable. The voices, she said, came with light, not just metaphorical light, actual glowing brilliance that filled her mind and heart. And if you're thinking, that sounds suspiciously like a migraine, well, so did some of her contemporaries. But Jeanne wasn't here for medical theories. She was here for destiny. Let's take a reflective pause here. Imagine you're a medieval peasant who's never left your village, never seen the ocean, and barely knows the alphabet. And one morning, you wake up believing God himself has personally assigned you a quest. What do? Do you ignore it and go back to milking the cows? Or do you start preparing for war? Jeanne predictably chose the second option. Over the next few years, the voices became her compass. They told her to stay pure, stay brave, and one day, seek out the Dauphin, the almost king of France, because he'd need her. She took that as literal instruction, not metaphor. And when she said it out loud, people didn't know whether to laugh or bow. But make no mistake, this wasn't some whimsical fantasy. Jeanne's faith was absolute. It radiated from her like heat from a forge. Even those who doubted her couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Her conviction was disarming. You could mock her, but you couldn't move her. And that's the thing about true believers, they make everyone else nervous. Faith like that is magnetic, dangerous even, especially in a time when the church was the only one allowed to have direct conversations with God. But Jeanne didn't care about politics or hierarchies. She wasn't reading theology. She was living it. Her voices didn't tell her to obey priests. They told her to lead armies, which, to the medieval mind, was like being told by your boss to go build a spaceship. Completely absurd, but also strangely irresistible. Around this time, the English were closing in on Orleans, one of France's last strongholds. The country was bleeding morale. The nobles were tired of losing, and the peasants were tired of paying for it. Jeanne's prophecies started sounding less like delusion and more like hope disguised as madness. Still, nobody was volunteering to take her to the king. So, naturally, she decided to do it herself. A teenage girl walking through war-torn France, claiming divine backing. It's the kind of story that would sound like folklore if it weren't so well documented. When she finally convinced a local garrison commander to listen, Robert de Baudricourt, a man whose patience ranked somewhere between irritable and constipated, he laughed in her face. She told him France would lose unless he helped her reach the Dauphin. He told her to go home and milk something. So she did, but not before predicting an upcoming French defeat. And when that exact defeat happened weeks later, Baudricourt's laughter turned into an awkward silence. That's the moment Jeanne's story stopped being dismissed and started being investigated. Because if there's one thing medieval men hated more than heresy, it was being wrong. Soon, whispers spread again. The girl from Domremy might actually be real, the one foretold to save France. Her reputation grew faster than the plague. The devout saw prophecy. The skeptics saw strategy. Either way, people were listening. And Jeanne, fueled by divine urgency, set her sights on the king. The voices had said it clearly. She would find him, convince him, and lead his armies to victory. Simple plan. Just a few logistical nightmares and several layers of gender-based disbelief in the way. But here's where her story twists. Because what's most striking isn't the supernatural element. It's her certainty. Jeanne didn't wait for permission. She believed herself entirely, and that belief bent the world around her. That's what made her dangerous. We tend to think faith is soft. Candles, prayers, comfort. Jeanne's faith was iron. It didn't soothe. It demanded. She didn't ask God to save France. She told everyone he already had, and she was the courier. And the craziest part? It worked. Soon, she'd march into the royal court, a barefoot peasant claiming to be the voice of heaven. The kind of introduction that should have ended with her thrown out by guards. Instead, history paused. Because when Jeanne spoke, people listened. Even when they didn't believe her, they wanted to. She was everything France needed at its lowest moment. Conviction, courage, and just enough chaos to make things interesting. So, as her voices whispered louder and her mission grew clearer, she prepared to step into a world that had no place for her, and force it to make one anyway. Would you follow a voice no one else could hear? Jeanne did, and that voice was about to make history very, very uncomfortable. By early 1429, Jeanne had what every successful influencer has, an unshakable belief in her message and absolutely no evidence to back it up. She was 16, armed with a rusty dream and divine customer service from 3 very busy saints. But there was one small obstacle between her and destiny: convincing the actual King of France to take her seriously. Now, Charles VII wasn't your typical God and glory monarch. He was more like a man reluctantly pretending to be one. The guy had spent most of his life being told he wasn't the real heir, that the English owned half his country, and that his mother had publicly declared him illegitimate. Medieval family therapy at its finest. By the time Jeanne set out to meet him, Charles was emotionally exhausted and politically cornered. But Jeanne didn't care. She had her mission, and thanks to her recent predicted battle loss mic drop moment, she finally had some escorts willing to take her seriously, or at least take her far enough that she'd stop talking about holy visions in their village tavern. Picture the scene. A teenage girl in patched clothes, riding a horse through war-torn France, armed with faith and a farmer's stubbornness. Every town she passed through, people whispered. Some laughed, some crossed themselves, some stared like they were seeing a ghost. But Jeanne never broke character. She wasn't traveling to ask for permission. She was traveling to deliver God's message. There's a difference. When she arrived in Chinon, where Charles's court was hiding, the guards took one look at her and immediately tried to send her home. But Jeanne refused to budge. She told them she had urgent news for the king, direct from heaven. The guards laughed. Then they saw her eyes. Something about her was unsettling. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't pleading. She was certain. Word spread fast. The girl who hears angels was here, and she wanted an audience with the king. It took days, maybe weeks, before they agreed. Not because they believed her, but because court life was boring, and everyone loves a spectacle. So, at last, Jeanne was summoned. The Dauphin, ever cautious, decided to test her. He disguised himself among his courtiers, hoping to trick her. Classic insecure royal move. But when Jeanne entered the grand hall, surrounded by nobles, tapestries, and the heavy perfume of skepticism, she didn't hesitate. She walked straight past the imposter nobles, turned, and bowed directly to the disguised king. Everyone froze, even Charles. No one knew how she'd recognized him. Some said divine guidance. Others said she just had good instincts and better eyesight. But in that single moment, the room shifted. This wasn't just a farm girl anymore. This was someone who knew things. Charles, playing it cool, questioned her cautiously. She told him that God had sent her to drive the English out and to see him crowned king at Reims. Which, if you think about it, is like a random teenager walking into the Pentagon today and saying, "Hey, I've got a message from heaven. Give me a tank." And yet, her conviction cracked through the cynicism. Charles, who had heard endless advisors, priests and fortune-tellers, found himself wanting to believe this barefoot visionary. Maybe because she was new, maybe because she was fearless, or maybe because faith is contagious when everything else has failed. Still, he wasn't completely naive. He ordered theologians to examine her, to make sure she wasn't, possessed or insane, the medieval HR process. For days, clerics grilled her on theology, virginity, and motive. They tried to trip her up, find contradictions, expose sin. But she didn't falter. She answered their questions with clarity that unnerved them. One inquisitor reportedly said, "I have found no evil in her, only goodness, humility, and the fear of God," which, translated, means, "I can't explain it, but she scares me a little." At one point, she was asked how she could be certain her voices were divine, not demonic. She replied, "How else could I tell but by the goodness of the message?" Mic drop. Even the priests had to admit that was better theology than most of them could muster before breakfast. The report came back. Jeanne was sane, pure, and, inconveniently, convincing. The church couldn't find a reason to stop her, and Charles couldn't find one not to try her plan. Let that sink in. A teenage peasant girl had just talked her way into the French military. No noble blood, no army background, just charisma and the kind of confidence you can only get from believing angels are your PR team. Soon, Charles gave her a suit of armor, custom-made, because apparently divine mission comes with a budget, and a white banner embroidered with the words Jesus Maria. She wasn't going to fight for France. She was going to fight for God's marketing department. And the soldiers? They were confused. Some were inspired. Others just wanted to see if she'd actually show up on the battlefield or vanish into legend. A few joked she'd bring bad luck, but none of them could ignore her presence. There's something deeply unsettling about unwavering conviction, especially when you've lost every war for decades. Still, the court was divided. Half thought she was a prophet. The other half thought she was a distraction. But Charles, desperate for hope, gave her what she wanted most: command access to the army at Orleans. That decision would either make him a legend or a lunatic. Before she left, Jeanne met privately with the Dauphin again. No one knows exactly what she said, but contemporary witnesses claim she revealed something to him that no one could have known except by divine revelation. Whatever it was, it broke him. He emerged from the meeting pale and trembling, and, from that moment, he believed her completely. That's the weird part about Jeanne's story. She didn't win people over with logic or proof. She won them over by making them feel something that had been missing for years: hope. In a world drowning in cynicism, she reminded them of faith, and that might have been her most dangerous weapon. By spring 1429, Jeanne was ready to ride with the army. Armor polished, banner raised, confidence unshaken. The soldiers looked at her like she was either a miracle or a myth waiting to happen. But in just a few weeks, that myth would set fire to everything they thought they knew about God, war, and power. Because when Jeanne rode into Orleans, she didn't just change the course of a battle. She changed the course of history. Spring 1429. The city of Orleans is suffocating. The English have it surrounded like a medieval noose. Walls of men, mud, and malice. Supplies are low, morale is lower, and France's military reputation has already face-planted into the mud. If you asked anyone at the time, they'd tell you Orleans was done for, finished, ready to become another sad entry in England's victory scrapbook. And then, one morning, the French army hears an unfamiliar sound approaching from the horizon. Horses, armor, and, oh yeah, the voice of a teenage girl shouting orders like she owns the place. Jeanne la Pucelle had arrived. To the veterans of war, she looked absurd. A 17-year-old in gleaming white armor, riding a black horse, carrying a flag instead of a weapon. But there was something about her that froze everyone mid-skepticism. Her confidence was nuclear, her energy contagious. Soldiers who'd been muttering about retreat now stood straighter, like hope had just walked into camp wearing braids. From the moment she arrived, things started to shift. Jeanne didn't just rally troops, she ignited them. She talked about God like he was on the payroll. "He has sent me to save France," she told the men. Not maybe, not I think, just pure, unfiltered certainty. And it worked. You could almost hear the collective thought ripple through camp. Well, it's been 20 years of failure. Might as well try divine intervention. Now, Jeanne wasn't a military strategist. She didn't study maps or troop formations. But she had something the generals didn't: clarity. While they argued over logistics, she made decisions. Fast, decisive. Belief moves quicker than bureaucracy, and Jeanne had no patience for red tape. She insisted they go on the offensive immediately. The commanders balked. The English were entrenched, the odds were terrible, and attacking would be suicidal. Jeanne didn't care. She said, "The time for doubt is over." Then she prayed, mounted up, and led the charge. And that's when things got biblical. On May 7th, 1429, the French attacked the English fortifications around Orleans. Jeanne, waving her white banner, was right in the front, unarmed. Arrows flew like angry bees. Smoke, chaos, screams. Everything about it should have ended in disaster. But somehow the French pushed through. Every time a soldier hesitated, Jeanne was there, shouting encouragement, dragging them forward by sheer willpower. Then an arrow struck her, right in the shoulder. She fell. The men panicked. Their miracle girl was bleeding. For a moment, the tide turned back toward despair. And then Jeanne, because she was apparently allergic to normal human behavior, pulled the arrow out of her own body, climbed back on her horse, and kept fighting. The soldiers went feral. Whatever hesitation they'd had evaporated. That's the thing about conviction. It's more contagious than any plague. By nightfall, the English line broke. Orleans was liberated, a victory France hadn't tasted in years. And at the center of it stood this peasant girl who refused to die on schedule. The victory spread through France like wildfire. The Maid of Orleans became a legend overnight. For the first time in decades, people dared to believe God might actually be French. But not everyone was thrilled. See, miracles are politically inconvenient. Jeanne's success didn't just save a city. It embarrassed powerful men. The nobles who had spent years losing suddenly looked replaceable. The church officials who doubted her were left explaining why God preferred a farm girl to train theologians. And Charles VII, poor, insecure Charles, was suddenly overshadowed by a teenager who claimed heaven was her co-pilot. Still, the momentum was undeniable. Soldiers began following Jeanne's banner more than the king's flag. Wherever she rode, victory followed. People swore they saw light around her, that arrows curved away mid-flight. Others whispered she was a witch. Either way, nobody could ignore her. And for a brief, shining moment, France remembered what winning felt like. Now, here's the weird part. Jeanne wasn't bloodthirsty. She wasn't even vengeful. Between battles, she prayed, wept for the dead, and begged soldiers to confess their sins before fighting. She was both a warrior and a saint in progress, equal parts terrifying and tender. That contradiction, purity wrapped in steel, made her unforgettable. But there was something deeper happening beneath the victories. Jeanne was rewriting what power looked like. In a world where authority came from birthright or brutality, she introduced a third option: faith. She didn't have a crown or an army of her own. She had conviction, and it moved kings like chess pieces. And that's dangerous, because faith doesn't ask permission, it demands transformation. Questions everything power wants to keep still. And if there's one thing the powerful can't stand, it's being reminded that truth might not wear silk robes. Still, for now, France didn't care. Orleans was free. Jeanne was hailed as a savior. Poets wrote songs. Priests preached sermons. Mothers named their daughters after her. But success, as always, has a smell. And vultures were circling. Because when a miracle becomes too popular, someone always tries to own it or destroy it. Jeanne's victories weren't just military. They were ideological. Every triumph made her less controllable. The church couldn't define her. The nobles couldn't manipulate her. Even the king, who owed her everything, began to fear her shadow. Yet Jeanne didn't see it. She wasn't scheming. She wasn't calculating. She truly believed this was God's mission, and she was just the instrument. But power doesn't care about purity. It only cares about control. And though she didn't know it yet, the same fire that made her famous would soon start to burn her from within. Still, for that one miraculous spring, Joan of Arc, Jeanne la Pucelle, had done the impossible. She turned faith into fuel, despair into defiance, and an army of broken men into believers. History would call it divine intervention. The soldiers called it the day they started winning again. Was it faith, luck, or mass hysteria? Maybe all three. But whatever it was, it worked. And it terrified everyone who had built their power on the assumption that miracles didn't happen anymore. Let that sink in. A 17-year-old girl rode into war with nothing but conviction and changed the trajectory of a nation. But success never goes unpunished. Because behind every miracle, someone's always waiting to claim the credit or light the match. Summer of 1429. France was buzzing. Orleans had been liberated, English forces were scrambling, and somewhere in a candlelit castle, Charles VII was finally starting to believe he might actually be king. Not just a placeholder with fancy robes, but the King of France. All thanks to a girl from a farm who claimed God texted her directly. Jeanne, however, wasn't celebrating. Victory wasn't the endgame. The Voices, her celestial project managers, had made it clear. The next mission was to get Charles officially crowned at Reims Cathedral, the ancient holy site where French kings were anointed. A symbolic coronation meant legitimacy. It meant divine approval. It meant the English and the doubters would have to shut up, at least for a week. But there was one minor problem. Reims was deep in enemy territory. The English and their allies held the roads, the bridges, and basically everything between here and the nearest hope. To most military strategists, the journey looked impossible. To Jeanne, it was Tuesday. She marched to Charles and said, in essence, "Pack your bags, Majesty. God says it's road trip time." Charles hesitated. His advisors, a swamp of cautious nobles and priests, tried to convince him otherwise. They said it was too dangerous, too reckless, too faith-based. But that's the thing about desperate men surrounded by bureaucrats. When someone actually believes in something, it's intoxicating. Jeanne's certainty pulled him in again. So, against every shred of conventional wisdom, they rode north. Jeanne at the front, Charles in the middle, and an army of bewildered soldiers behind them. Everywhere they went, towns that had once flown English flags suddenly switched sides. It wasn't about politics anymore, it was theater. The Maid of Orleans had become a national myth in real time. Picture it. Dusty roads, banners fluttering, peasants kneeling in the streets as the girl who claimed to speak to heaven rode by. The army didn't need to fight. People surrendered at the mere sight of her. Not because of force, but because of faith. The legend was doing the heavy lifting. Finally, in July, they reached Reims. And on the 17th, in the echoing splendor of the cathedral, Charles VII was crowned King of France. Gold, incense, choirs, the works. Jeanne stood beside him, holding her white banner higher than the crown itself. Witnesses said she cried, not from pride, but from relief. Her mission, as far as she knew, was complete. For that single, radiant moment, it looked like the story might actually end in peace. The kind of fairy tale history never delivers. But here's where things start to twist. Because power has a terrible memory. The minute Charles was crowned, the balance shifted. The mission that had made Jeanne indispensable now made her inconvenient. He no longer needed a saint. He needed stability. Jeanne had been the spark, but sparks are dangerous once the fire's lit. And Charles, well, he wasn't built for courage. He liked safety, ceremony, and people who didn't upstage him. Jeanne, bless her defiant little soul, did all three wrong. Her popularity scared him. Her certainty embarrassed his advisors. She spoke directly to God, and Charles couldn't even get his nobles to show up on time. Imagine the awkwardness. You've just been crowned king, everyone's chanting your name, and the crowd keeps looking at the teenager next to you like she's the real hero. That's when the slow-motion betrayal began. The king's court politely started to manage her, which is medieval for please go away. They sent her on smaller missions, delayed her requests for troops, and whispered that maybe her divine hotline was starting to get static. Jeanne didn't get it. She wasn't political. She thought everyone wanted the same thing, victory. She didn't realize that, for people in power, victory isn't about winning wars. It's about keeping control. Still, she refused to fade into the background. Her voices hadn't told her to stop, and she wasn't about to start doubting heaven just because some nervous nobles didn't like her confidence. She asked Charles for permission to continue fighting, to push the English completely out of France. He mumbled something royal and non-committal. Translation: "No, but I'm too cowardly to say it out loud." You could almost feel the shift in the air, that quiet dread that comes when belief collides with politics. Jeanne's divine mission had reached its awkward sequel. Thanks for the miracle. Please leave quietly. But she didn't. She couldn't. Her faith wouldn't let her. Jeanne had done everything her voices told her to do. And now that the king was crowned, they still hadn't said stop. So she kept pushing, planning, fighting. while the men she'd saved slowly stepped back and let her become a liability. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? How quickly people turn on their saviors once they've served their purpose. In the following months, Jeanne's influence began to unravel. The church started muttering about pride. The nobles started muttering about control. The English naturally muttered about revenge. She'd become too symbolic, too loud, too independent, the kind of figure kings can't control and enemies can't ignore. And Charles? He smiled, nodded, and quietly withdrew his support. That's when the prophecy started curdling into a curse. The girl who had carried France's faith on her shoulders was suddenly carrying its suspicion. The court that once cheered her began to whisper that maybe she'd gone too far, that maybe her victories weren't miracles, maybe they were witchcraft. Isn't it funny how fast gratitude turns into fear? By late 1429, the once celebrated Maid of Orleans was no longer the jewel of France. She was its wild card. The same men who had knelt at her feet during the coronation were now sharpening their quills to write her downfall. But Jeanne didn't notice the knives. She still believed. She still saw God in the details. She still thought the king she'd crowned would protect her. Spoiler, he wouldn't. Her next campaign would take her north against enemy forces without the full support of the crown. A suicidal mission, strategically speaking. But Jeanne didn't see suicide. She saw obedience. She was about to walk into the trap that would end her life and immortalize her name. Because the miracle girl didn't know that miracles always come with an invoice. What happens when your miracle becomes someone else's embarrassment? We're about to find out. Spring, 1430. The wind in northern France carried the smell of mud, sweat, and betrayal, though Jeanne la Pucelle couldn't smell the last part yet. After Reims, the glow of victory had dimmed, and the once adoring French court was now acting like she was an inconvenient reminder of their own cowardice. She wanted to press the advantage. "Let's take Paris," she said, like it was that simple. But Charles VII's inner circle had other plans. Diplomatic talks, ceasefires, and long lunches. Translation: they were done with the war as soon as it stopped threatening their wine supply. Jeanne, meanwhile, had zero chill. God hadn't told her to stop, so why would she? But disobedience, even holy disobedience, comes with consequences. When she marched into battle without royal permission, she crossed an invisible line. The court began to whisper, "She's reckless. She's losing it. Maybe she's not divine after all." The English, of course, were delighted. The more France doubted her, the easier their job became. By May, Jeanne found herself near Compiègne, a fortified city under siege. She went to help defend it, not because the king asked, but because she felt she had to. The city's gates opened for her, the people cheered, and for a brief moment it felt like old times. The Maid of Orleans, riding through the dust, defying logic and expectation. But this battle wasn't blessed, it was bait. On May 23, 1430, Jeanne and her troops clashed with Burgundian forces, technically French but loyal to England. It was chaos. Arrows, shouting, banners twisting in the wind. The Burgundians fought with desperation, the kind that smells like coin. Jeanne fought with faith. When her men began to retreat toward the gates of Compiègne, she covered their withdrawal. Yes, personally. The city guards, panicked, slammed the gates shut to keep the enemy out. Jeanne was still outside. The sound of that gate closing echoed like fate's cruel punctuation mark. And just like that, the untouchable Maid of Orleans was surrounded. She was dragged from her horse, struggling, her banner ripped from her hands. Soldiers shouted, "We have her! We have the witch!" Her captors jeered, her armor dented under rough hands. The divine mission that had terrified kings and inspired peasants ended in the mud, bound by ropes and disbelief. Here's the part that stings. She wasn't captured by the English. Not yet. She was captured by fellow Frenchmen. The Burgundians were supposed to be countrymen, not enemies. But loyalty in the 15th century was cheaper than bread. They sold her to the English for 10,000 livres, roughly the cost of a modest castle or a really fancy dinner with Satan. Meanwhile, Charles VII, the man she'd crowned, did nothing. He could have ransomed her. He didn't. He could have sent an army. He didn't. He could have written one letter, One plea, one gesture of loyalty. He didn't. It's a strange kind of silence when a country lets its miracle rot in a cell. The French court pretended not to notice. They called her capture regrettable. The same tone you'd use for dropping a loaf of bread. The priests who once blessed her started crafting excuses. The nobles whispered that maybe God was done with her. And Charles? He prayed quietly for her soul, which is medieval code for, "Don't come back, you're politically inconvenient." While France looked away, the English looked thrilled. This was propaganda gold. The woman who'd embarrassed them at Orleans was finally in their hands. They didn't just want to kill her, they wanted to unmake her, to prove she was never divine, never holy, just a delusional girl dressed in men's armor. So they locked her up. Iron cage, cold cell, chains heavy enough to remind her what the world thinks of women who don't stay in their lane. Still, even in captivity, Jeanne refused to play victim. She prayed. She sang. She taunted her guards. One chronicler said she told her captors, "You think you've caught me? Wait until you face my king." And she didn't mean Charles. But faith, no matter how fierce, has limits when you're starving and alone. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months. Her once radiant certainty began to flicker like a candle under siege. And every time her spirits wavered, her captors tightened the screws. They interrogated her, mocked her visions, and reminded her, constantly, that no rescue was coming. Let that sink in. The girl who led armies now couldn't even lift her wrists. The king she crowned forgot her. The church she revered prepared to condemn her. And the voices that once spoke so clearly began to fade into silence. Maybe that's what betrayal really is. Not a knife in the back, but the deafening quiet after you realize no one's fighting for you anymore. Still, Jeanne held on. When the Burgundians finally sold her to the English, she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply said, "I was born to do this." And in a way, she was right, because while her captors thought they were ending her story, they were about to make it eternal. Jeanne la Pucelle, the girl who refused to surrender, was about to face her final and greatest battle. Not against soldiers, but against the machinery of faith itself. They wouldn't kill her right away. That would be too merciful. No, first, they would strip her of her faith, her dignity, and her story. They'd drag her before a court of priests and scholars, men with fragile egos and long memories, and they'd try to make her recant everything that made her dangerous. Because for powerful men, there's nothing more terrifying than a woman who still believes she's right. Rouen, 1431. The cold air in Normandy carried the heavy scent of smoke, ink, and sanctimony. A perfect combination for a show trial. Jeanne la Pucelle, the girl who had crowned a king, was about to be uncrowned by the church. Not by swords or armies this time, but by paperwork. Because when faith scares powerful men, they don't fight it, they bureaucratize it. Her prison cell was small, damp, and crawling with irony. Guards watched her day and night. Not noble knights, English soldiers who treated her like both a trophy and a threat. They laughed when she prayed, mocked her voices, and called her witch. She was 19. The trial began in February. 59 men, priests, theologians, and legal scholars, gathered to judge a teenage peasant for the crime of believing too much. If you're picturing a fair trial, stop. This was theater. A roast disguised as righteousness. The English had one goal: prove that the girl who embarrassed their army was not a saint, but a heretic. Her prosecutor, Bishop Pierre Cauchon, was a man who'd sold his soul for political advancement and a decent seat at dinner. He worked for the English, but spoke for God. Convenient, right? His plan was simple. Twist Jeanne's words until her faith looked like blasphemy. Each morning, she was dragged into court, still in chains, still exhausted, facing a wall of men who saw her as a problem to be solved. They grilled her for hours about her visions, her faith, her clothes, especially her clothes. Because, you see, one of her biggest crimes wasn't hearing voices or leading armies. It was wearing armor. In medieval theology, a woman in men's clothing was scandalous, basically cosplay-level heresy. They accused her of cross-dressing against God's law. Jeanne explained, patiently, that she wore armor for protection, because men tried to assault her. The priests nodded solemnly, then scribbled, "Further evidence of witchcraft." But here's where the script flipped. Jeanne wasn't intimidated. She faced every question head-on, turning theological traps into sermons. When asked if she believed she was in God's grace, a trick question meant to catch her either in arrogance or doubt, she replied calmly, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may He keep me there." The courtroom went silent. Even Cauchon blinked. It was a masterclass in verbal judo. She'd just dodged the question entirely, without contradicting herself or the Bible. Every time they thought they cornered her, she outsmarted them. The illiterate farm girl who couldn't even read her own charges was mentally outpacing men with decades of theological training. Imagine the frustration, like trying to bully a ghost that keeps quoting scripture back at you. Still, the outcome was pre-written. This wasn't justice. It was revenge wearing robes. They wanted her to confess, to say her voices were hallucinations, that her mission was prideful fantasy, that she was nothing but a puppet of the devil. But Jeanne refused. Again and again. She told them she'd rather die than deny what God had told her. That kind of conviction doesn't fit neatly into court documents. So they kept changing the rules. When she gave brilliant answers, they accused her of witchcraft, because naturally, no woman could be that clever without Satan's help. When she faltered, they called her insane. And through it all, her captors chipped away at her humanity. They cut her hair. They dressed her in men's clothes again, not by choice, but because the guards kept harassing her. Then they used that against her in court. One interrogator asked if her voices still spoke to her. She said yes, and that they comforted her. That was all they needed. They wrote it down as proof she preferred demons to priests. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine that. You've led armies, changed history, and inspired millions. And now you're chained to a chair while men with feather pens debate whether your belief in God makes you evil. It's almost too poetic and too cruel. But even in humiliation, Jeanne remained unshakable. Witnesses said she glowed when she spoke of her visions, that her eyes burned with something impossible to contain. One guard reportedly said, "If she is not from God, then God has no daughter." Of course, that didn't make it into the official transcript. After weeks of interrogation, they finally declared her guilty. But not of witchcraft, at least not yet. They needed her alive a little longer. So they offered her a deal. Sign a confession, admit she was wrong, and they'd spare her life. Tired, starved, and terrified, Jeanne faltered. Under pressure and threat of death, she signed a paper she couldn't read. Her voice was shaking when she did it. The priests nodded, satisfied. The story could end neatly. The heretic recants, the church wins, the world moves on. But history doesn't do neat endings. Within days, Jeanne took it back. She told them she'd lied, that she'd signed only because they threatened her with fire. "I would rather die," she said, "than deny my voices again." That single sentence sealed her fate. Bishop Cauchon smiled. The paperwork was complete. The illusion of justice had been served. And the girl who once spoke like an angel was now officially damned by the men who claimed to speak for God. She was sentenced to death. But not just any death, a public burning. A purification by fire, they called it. The irony is medieval poetry. The same church that preached eternal light would destroy the girl who embodied it. So, after all the questions, all the theology, all the traps, her real crime wasn't heresy. It was being unstoppable. Because in a world built on obedience, faith like hers was rebellion. How do you win when truth isn't what they're looking for? You don't. You burn. Rouen prison. Cold stone, darker nights, and the smell of damp iron. Jeanne la Pucelle, the Maid of Orleans, sat in her cell, no longer the gleaming warrior saint from the battlefields, but a chained girl in men's clothes, guarded by men who spat the word, which like it tasted holy. The trial was over. The ink on her death sentence hadn't even dried. Yet the English still weren't satisfied. They wanted to see her break, to crush the faith that had humiliated their armies. Because burning a body is easy, but burning belief, that takes precision. Her interrogators came daily now, their words sharp as knives. "Do your voices still speak?" they asked, leaning in close. Do they tell you you'll be saved? Jeanne, hollow-eyed and exhausted, said yes, though her voice trembled. They tell me I shall be delivered, but I do not know when. And in that moment, for the first time, her certainty cracked. Because the voices, the saints, the guiding lights she had trusted since childhood, had gone quiet. Days passed in that silence. The guards jeered. The candlelight flickered. Every night she prayed, whispering to the heavens. But all she heard was her own breath bouncing off stone. Was it punishment? Abandonment? Or had she finally reached the point where even faith needs to rest? No one knows. All we know is that, for the first time in her short, blinding life, Jeanne felt human. Terrifyingly, heartbreakingly human. But she didn't give the English the breakdown they were waiting for. Even in despair, she still had defiance. When they mocked her, she mocked back. When they offered false mercy, she called it out. The same stubborn fire that once led armies now kept her alive in the dark. Still, they wanted a confession. Something public, humiliating, final. So they brought her before the judges one last time, waving parchment and promises. Sign this, they said, and we'll spare your life. And after days of sleep deprivation, isolation, and threats of being burned alive, Jeanne, the girl who had faced entire armies, finally gave in. She signed. That moment, that quivering signature, was what her captors had been waiting for. The church declared victory. The heretic had recanted. The paperwork was filed. The gossip began. And the story should have ended there, with Jeanne fading into quiet disgrace. Another example of what happens when faith bites back. But faith, as Jeanne proved again and again, doesn't follow scripts. Just days later, she changed her mind. She called for her judges and said, I retract. I take it all back. My voices were true. My mission was holy. God knows it. The church nearly choked on its own hypocrisy. They had their confession, their perfect ending, and now she'd ruined it. Her retraction was more than courage. It was rebellion. She was no longer the shining symbol of divine triumph, nor the frightened girl seeking mercy. She was something far more dangerous, someone with nothing left to lose. Let's take a breath here. Imagine it. 19 years old, alone, condemned by your own people, your God seemingly silent. And instead of begging for forgiveness, you look your executioners in the eye and say, you're wrong. I still believe. That isn't madness. That's transcendence. When word spread that Jeanne had recanted her recantation, Rouen buzzed with outrage and fear. The English cursed her as a liar. The clergy called her possessed. But among the French commoners, something stirred. Even those who doubted her miracles couldn't ignore her courage. Because to defy death is one thing, to defy shame is another entirely. The court reconvened, pretending to be solemn, but everyone knew this was theater. The verdict had been decided long ago. Her relapse into heresy was just the church's polite term for she embarrassed us again. They sentenced her to die at the stake. Jeanne didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply asked for a cross. When they refused, a sympathetic guard carved one out of a stick and handed it to her. She kissed it and smiled, that terrifying, peaceful kind of smile that only comes when you've made peace with the impossible. In those final hours, the silence of the voices became its own kind of answer. Maybe heaven had stopped speaking not because it abandoned her, but because she no longer needed direction. She was the message now. Reflect on that. The same girl who once rode into battle believing angels walked beside her now sat in a dungeon, preparing to meet them face to face. And still, she didn't waver. When the guards mocked her again, she said, You think you are hurting me, but you are wrong. It is you who condemn yourselves. That line, barely recorded, whispered through bars, has survived nearly 6 centuries. Because even in chains, Jeanne never lost the one weapon no one could take. Her conviction. Her story had started with voices, but it was ending in silence. A silence louder than any sermon. Yesterday's saint had become today's scandal. But legends have a strange habit of growing in the dark. As the night before her execution fell, the people of Rouen couldn't sleep. Some said they heard her singing in her cell. Others swore they saw light under the door. Maybe they imagined it. Maybe they didn't. Either way, when dawn came, the air felt different, thick, electric, as if the world itself knew it was about to lose someone extraordinary. Let that sink in. She'd rather burn than lie, because the voices might have gone silent, but Jeanne had already become one herself. Rouen, May 30th, 1431. The morning began like any other, gray, cold, and indifferent. But for the city's people, something different was stirring in the air. The church bells rang not for prayer, but for punishment. Soldiers marched through the cobblestone streets, herding crowds toward the old market square. There, in the center, stood a wooden platform stacked with straw and kindling, a stage built for a spectacle. At 19 years old, Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan of Arc, was about to be burned alive. It was supposed to be justice. It was, in reality, an execution dressed up as salvation. The English wanted revenge, the church wanted closure, and the crowd wanted a story. They came to see a witch die, not realizing they were about to witness a saint being born. As she stepped out of the prison cart, chained but upright, the crowd hushed. She looked smaller than they remembered. The iron had stripped her of weight and warmth, but her eyes, still fierce, still burning with that unnerving certainty that made kings tremble. A monk followed behind her, mumbling a final sermon, probably to soothe his own conscience. Jeanne asked for a cross. Someone handed her a wooden one. She kissed it, pressed it to her chest, and whispered a prayer. Then she asked that another cross be held high, so she could see it through the flames. "Hold it before my eyes," she said softly, "so I may see my Savior as I die." Even the guards, the same men who had mocked her for months, fell silent. It's hard to ridicule someone who walks into their own death with peace on their face. The bishop who had condemned her, Pierre Cauchon, that walking embodiment of hypocrisy, gave a short speech about saving her soul. He said it was a mercy. Jeanne nodded once, then replied, "Bishop, I die through you." Imagine the chill that went through the crowd. Even in her final moments, she spoke like a prophet. The executioner lit the fire. At first, it was small, just the crackle of wood and the hiss of smoke. Then it caught, spreading upward, wrapping the pyre in orange fury. Jeanne didn't scream. Witnesses said she prayed, out loud, over and over, calling the name of Jesus until her voice broke. The wind shifted, carrying her words across the square. "Jesus! Jesus!" she cried. 6 times, they said. 6 times before her voice was swallowed by the roar of the flames. Even hardened soldiers wept. One English captain reportedly muttered, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." And that's the part the history books can't quite capture. The silence that followed. The way the fire died down and left behind not just ash, but guilt. People went home that night uneasy. The church had claimed victory, but it didn't feel like one. Because when you burn conviction, it doesn't disappear, it spreads. The executioner himself broke down. He swore he saw a dove fly up from the smoke. Others said it was just sparks. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something left that square that day, something untouchable. Her ashes were collected and dumped into the Seine River, as if France could wash itself clean of her. But the river carried her story farther than anyone could have predicted. Even her enemies couldn't erase her. Chroniclers wrote about her bravery in grudging admiration. Theologians debated whether her faith had been madness or miracle. And the people, the same people who had once doubted her, whispered her name in candlelit corners. Because deep down, everyone knew what had really happened that day. A terrified world had met someone who truly believed. And when they couldn't control her, they called it heresy. Let that sink in. Her greatest crime wasn't disobedience. It was being right too soon. In an age where women were told to pray, not lead, Jeanne dared to do both. She didn't just speak to God. She answered him. And that, apparently, was too much for the church to handle. For centuries afterward, her execution would haunt France. Every kingdom needs a scapegoat before it finds a saint, and Jeanne's ashes became the ink for its redemption story. But on that morning in Rouen, none of that mattered. She didn't know she'd become a legend. She didn't know that kings would one day kneel under her banner. She only knew she was dying for what she believed was true. And in a way, that's why her story endures, because in a world built on compromise, she refused to compromise herself. Fire didn't destroy her. It revealed her. Faith, stripped of its armor, burned into clarity. So, yes, the English thought they were silencing her. They thought they'd erased the witch. But instead, they accidentally wrote a prophecy in smoke. If she died a heretic, why do we still whisper her name? Because the truth, like her, doesn't stay buried. It smolders quietly, defiantly, waiting for the next brave soul to breathe it back to life. 25 years had passed since the flames at Rouen turned a 19-year-old girl into smoke and symbol. France had moved on, or at least pretended to. Kings had aged, borders shifted, alliances changed hands like coins. But something in the air still stung. A ghost lingered over the throne. Jeanne's name was whispered not as a curse anymore, but as an ache. Even the church, that grand machine of ritual and reputation, was starting to squirm. Because, inconveniently, France had won. The English were retreating, the Dauphin was secure on his throne, and history was quietly beginning to agree that maybe, just maybe, the girl they burned was right all along. And that, of course, made everyone who condemned her look like, well, sinners with paperwork. Bishop Pierre Cauchon, her prosecutor, had died a few years after the trial, unloved and unmissed. Some said he fell ill. Others whispered that the devil came to collect early. Whatever the cause, he didn't get the sainthood PR makeover Jeanne eventually would. Ironically, the man who had judged her soul would never find peace for his own. By the 1450s, the French crown was thriving under Charles VII, the very man Jeanne had crowned before being abandoned by him. Imagine that irony. The king alive, comfortable, and piously thanking God every Sunday, while the woman who handed him his throne was still officially labeled a heretic. Even Charles couldn't quite live with that. He'd spent years pretending not to hear her name. But as the church's whispers grew louder, and Francis' conscience started to itch, he finally ordered a retrial, a nullification trial, as they called it, which is medieval speak for oops, our bad. The church sent out investigators. They interviewed everyone who'd known her. Family, soldiers, priests, peasants. Some described her as radiant, others as fierce, but none as evil. Her village priest wept when he spoke of her. One soldier swore that when he'd fought beside her, he saw her wounds heal faster than anyone's should. Suddenly, the heretic narrative didn't hold up so well. The inquiry dragged on for years. The church, as usual, preferred to move at the speed of bureaucracy. After all, rewriting history takes time, especially when you're the one who lit the match. But the evidence piled up, page after uncomfortable page, until the truth was too loud to ignore. Witness after witness said the same thing. Jeanne was good. Jeanne was honest. Jeanne was innocent. The English representatives, of course, were furious. They didn't attend the hearings. Can you blame them? No one wants to show up to the trial where history calls you the villain. Finally, in 1456, the verdict was announced. The court declared the original trial tainted by corruption, deceit, and fraud. Jeanne d'Arc was posthumously acquitted of all charges. Her name was cleared. Her soul, they said, was pure. Cue the organ music. The church made a show of it. Big ceremony, banners, bells. They declared her a good Christian woman. They spoke of her faith, her courage, her sacrifice. The same church that had once called her a heretic now praised her as a model of devotion. It was the medieval equivalent of a PR rebrand. But here's the kicker. All this forgiveness was for them, not for her. Jeanne didn't need absolution. The men who'd killed her did. The retrial wasn't really about truth. It was about guilt management. The church wanted to tidy its conscience, and Charles wanted to polish his legacy. It's easy to worship someone after they're dead. They can't embarrass you anymore. Still, for ordinary people, the retrial meant something deeper. For them, Jeanne's story wasn't about theology. It was about humanity. She was proof that faith could exist outside the walls of cathedrals. That courage could come from the muddiest of places. That even when the system crushes you, your story can rise again. And in a poetic twist, the same city that watched her burn was now the one that celebrated her vindication. Rouen, haunted by the memory of its own cruelty, filled its churches with prayers in her name. The square where she'd been executed was suddenly treated like holy ground. People said they could still smell smoke when they passed by, not the scent of sin but of sanctity. Let's pause here. Imagine being a villager who'd once cheered at her trial, now kneeling at the same spot to ask her forgiveness. That's not history, that's confession. But guilt fades faster than memory. The church didn't canonize her yet. Oh no, that took another few centuries. It's funny how even sainthood has a waiting list. For now, she was rehabilitated, cleared, acceptable, a safe version of faith. Better late than never, right? Of course, it was a hollow comfort. Jeanne didn't get her life back. She didn't get an apology from the king who abandoned her, or from the priests who watched her burn. All she got was a new label, martyr, neatly stamped over heretic, a tidy ending for people who wanted to feel righteous without actually changing anything. But maybe, in a way, that's the point. Jeanne never needed their approval. Her story wasn't about winning trials. It was about proving that conviction outlasts cruelty. The church may have cleared her name, but the world already had. By the time the retrial ended, France had begun to see her not as a mistake to fix, but as a mirror, one that showed their cowardice and courage in equal measure. She was no longer the girl who died at the stake. She was the spirit that refused to. And so, 25 years after her death, the world finally admitted what her executioners couldn't. That faith doesn't burn, it transforms. Still, if we're being honest, it's hard not to roll your eyes at the timing. It's easy to praise a prophet once she's no longer around to question you. But history does love irony. The church got its redemption points. The crown got its legacy polished. And Jeanne? She got eternity. The moment Jeanne's name was cleared, France exhaled. Not from relief, but from the sudden rush of opportunity. A dead saint, after all, is good business, especially one with that rare marketing trifecta. She was young, holy, and extremely photogenic in armor. The church had forgiven her, but the world wasn't about to stop there. They were going to monetize her. Within a few decades, Jeanne's story began mutating, not maliciously at first, just commercially. The painters started it. They loved the irony. A peasant girl glowing in divine light, leading grim-faced soldiers twice her size. They painted her in shining plate mail, angel halos, and gowns that looked like they came straight from Celestial Fashion Week. Never mind that the real Jeanne probably smelled like smoke, mud, and anxiety. Then came the poets, because nothing says redemption arc like a few hundred lines of rhyming nationalism. They rewrote her life as divine tragedy, transforming her into France's favorite ghost. She wasn't Jeanne the human anymore. She was Jeanne the idea. By the 16th century, the myth was out of control. Protestants called her a symbol of Catholic arrogance. Catholics called her proof of divine favoritism. Monarchists claimed her for the crown. Revolutionaries claimed her for the people. She was everyone's mascot, the Swiss Army knife of political propaganda. It's funny, isn't it? How once someone's dead, everyone suddenly agrees with them. But even as her story spread, the truth started to fade. The rough edges of her humanity, the fear, the mistakes, the exhaustion, were filed down until all that remained was sainthood-shaped perfection. The same people who couldn't stand her in life now recited her story to prove their own virtue. Jeanne's legend became a mirror, and everyone looked into it hoping to see themselves. The French monarchy used her to remind citizens that divine right was alive and well. See, they said, even God prefers France. Meanwhile, the church used her to prove that repentance worked. We may have accidentally burned a saint, they'd shrug. But look how holy we are for admitting it. Artists built careers on her tragedy. Every generation found a new angle. Joan as warrior, Joan as virgin, Joan as victim. In some versions, she's a feminist pioneer. In others, she's a vessel of divine submission. Each retelling said more about the storyteller than about Jeanne herself. The irony? Jeanne would have hated all of it. She didn't want fame. She wanted France to stop bleeding. She wanted the war to end. She wanted her king to listen to God instead of politicians. That's it. She didn't die to become a symbol. She died because the people in charge couldn't handle one. But history doesn't care about intentions. It cares about narratives. And Jeanne's narrative was irresistible. The girl who heard voices and changed the course of war became the perfect moral Rorschach test. By the 18th century, her story was practically mythology. Voltaire wrote about her, though not kindly. His version painted her as naive and absurd, the punchline of France's superstitious past. That was the Enlightenment for you. Reason first, miracle second. Jeanne became a cautionary tale, a relic of the old world, a reminder of how belief can turn people into zealots. But then came the 19th century, and the pendulum swung back. The Romantic poets resurrected her again, this time as a tragic heroine. She was no longer superstition. She was passion incarnate. Painters like Ingres and Rossetti filled galleries with her face. Eyes to heaven, jaw set, flames reflected in her armor. The tragedy was the point. France was obsessed. And why not? Jeanne was everything the nation wished it was. Pure, brave, divinely misunderstood. She became the national bedtime story, the one that made defeat sound noble and suffering sound sacred. Even politicians started quoting her. Every time France needed a morale boost, Jeanne's name got dragged out like an old flag. Liberals invoked her as a rebel, conservatives as a patriot. Monarchists said she fought for divine order. Republicans said she fought for the people. Everyone was right. Everyone was wrong. That's the trick with legends. They're empty enough for anyone to fill. And yet, beneath all that noise, something authentic survived. Because no matter how much they polished or twisted her story, they couldn't erase her defiance. The image of a teenage girl staring down kings and priests, that stuck. It always will. Modern scholars like to debate whether Jeanne's voices were divine, psychological, or political. But honestly, it doesn't matter. What matters is that she believed them. That belief changed history more effectively than any sword. She was the embodiment of what terrifies institutions most: conviction without permission. Let's take a breath here. Picture it, the banners, the paintings, the saints' medals, the bedtime stories. For 5 centuries, humanity has tried to contain Jeanne d'Arc in words and worship. And every attempt reveals the same uncomfortable truth. She's bigger than all of it. Because Jeanne's real power wasn't divine prophecy. It was her refusal to conform. She made faith look revolutionary, and that's something no church committee can trademark. Even today, her legend runs like a current through French identity. The statue in Paris's Place des Pyramids gleams under the sun. Jeanne on horseback, gold armor, flag raised high. Tourists take photos, students pass by without looking, and somewhere beneath all that modern noise, the wind still hums like a whisper. Do you remember me? So yes, the legend machine kept spinning. It always will. But if you listen closely, under the national anthems and art exhibitions, under the centuries of myth-making and marketing, you can still hear the faint echo of her real story. A story that began not in a cathedral or on a battlefield, but in the quiet faith of a farm girl who heard something sacred and decided to follow it. Do we remember her? Or the version that flatters us most? Maybe it doesn't matter, because somewhere between myth and memory, Jeanne's fire still burns, untamed, unowned, and inconveniently eternal. Fast forward 5 centuries. The war is over, the ashes are gone, and France now sells coffee in cafes named after the woman they once set on fire. Jeanne la Pucelle, the ghost of Rouen, has become a brand. Her face is everywhere. On stamps, statues, and souvenir mugs. She's been turned into everything from a feminist icon to a nationalist symbol to an anime character with suspiciously good hair. Joan of Arc isn't just a saint anymore. She's content. Welcome to the digital age, where the line between reverence and relevance is blurrier than ever. You can find her on TikTok edits set to moody orchestral music. You can find her in video games, swinging swords twice her size. She's even got Funko Pop figurines, proof that no one, not even a martyr, is safe from modern marketing. But here's the question. Does anyone still know her? Or have we just turned her into another aesthetic? The girl boss of God archetype, flattened for convenience and sold for clicks? It's a strange afterlife for someone who once defied entire armies. Jeanne died because she refused to play a role, and now she's played by everyone. Every generation redesigns her to match its mood. In the 20th century, she was the patron saint of patriotism. Soldiers painted her on tanks during both world wars. She was France's lucky charm, her spirit invoked whenever courage needed a face. In propaganda posters, she wasn't a martyr anymore. She was a mascot with better lighting. Then came Hollywood, and Jeanne got a new set of armor: cinematic martyrdom. In black and white films, she was stoic, saintly, tragic. By the 90s, she was fierce, loud, and armed with Hollywood cheekbones. Mila Jovovich screamed at heaven, and the box office screamed back. She was no longer the Joan of Arc. She was our Joan of Arc, customizable, remixable, endlessly editable. And yet, beneath the memes and marketing, something deeper still resonates. Because if you strip away the centuries of noise, Jeanne's story hits like a punch to the gut. A teenage girl believed something so strongly that every power structure around her had to destroy her. And even now, in a world that loves empowerment slogans but hates actual conviction, that kind of faith feels radical. You can't scroll past that. Let's be honest. Modern culture worships icons of rebellion, but only the kind that look good on posters. Jeanne wasn't convenient. She didn't tweet about courage. She embodied it. She didn't hashtag her faith. She lived it until it killed her. And yet, somehow, she still fits perfectly into the age of contradiction. Because she's both things at once. Saint and meme, prophet and brand, the most commodified rebel in history. It's easy to roll your eyes at it. Saint Joan as pop culture, you might say. But think about it. Doesn't it make sense? Every society reinvents its martyrs to suit its guilt. Jeanne's image reflects our own contradictions. We glorify courage while punishing sincerity. We love conviction, as long as it doesn't make us uncomfortable. Jeanne, in any century, is a problem. That's why she keeps coming back. There's something hypnotic about her story, not because of the miracles, but because of how painfully human it is. A girl hears a calling, acts on it, wins and dies for it. It's not divine mystery. It's the eternal script of human defiance. In a time when belief feels like a luxury, Jeanne's faith looks almost alien. She believed in something bigger than herself, not for fame, not for validation, but because she had to. And that's what gives her story modern weight. When people today call her a symbol of empowerment, they're half right. But empowerment isn't just self-love quotes and manifesting prosperity. Jeanne's version of empowerment came with firewood. Still, her presence in modern culture isn't all cheap imitation. There's sincerity in how she haunts us. Artists keep painting her, writers keep rewriting her, and every few years, some teenager discovers her story and feels that same spark. The impossible thought that maybe one person can still make the world flinch. Maybe that's why she endures. Jeanne's story hits the same nerve as every hero who refused to shut up when it mattered. In a world drowning in cynicism, she's proof that conviction, even naive conviction, still terrifies us. Let's pause here. Think about the last time you believed in something so fiercely that you were willing to risk being mocked, misunderstood, or metaphorically burned for it. Hard to remember, isn't it? Jeanne did that at 17. And maybe that's why her story keeps getting rebooted. Not because we've forgotten her, but because we're still trying to catch up. Every meme, movie, and monument is a translation. Humanity's attempt to understand a girl who did the unthinkable. She believed herself completely. In an era where doubt feels intellectual and irony feels safe, her story cuts through like a blade. It's the reminder we didn't ask for but probably need. That there's power in conviction, even when it costs everything. So yeah, maybe Jeanne d'Arc is a meme now. Maybe she's a hashtag, a marketing slogan, a piece of wall art on Etsy. But in between the irony and the idolatry, she's still whispering the same message she carried through the smoke. Don't just exist. Stand for something. In a time when faith is rare, maybe madness was her only language. And maybe, just maybe, it's the only one we still understand. Strip away the armor, the banners, the bonfire, and the saints' names, and what's left of Jeanne d'Arc's story isn't just religion. It's power. Faith versus authority. Conviction versus control. It's the same dual humanity keeps replaying like a bad sequel. The moment someone stands up and says, "I believe," a dozen others in silk robes and gold rings shout back, "Not like that, you don't." Jeanne's whole life was one long confrontation between the invisible and the institutional. She believed the voice of God spoke directly to her, not filtered through bishops, not approved by committees. And that right there was the scandal. Not her visions, not her victories. It was that she bypassed the middlemen. Because in medieval Europe, God was supposed to be a franchise. You prayed through the church, you obeyed through the crown, and you didn't go rogue with divine messaging. Jeanne was like an employee going straight to the CEO and skipping the manager. And managers hate that. The church called it heresy, but what they really meant was unauthorized communication. And it's funny, we pretend those power dynamics are ancient history, but look around. The uniforms have changed, the titles updated, but the game's the same. Speak a truth that threatens hierarchy, and you'll find your own version of an inquisition waiting. Cancel culture, censorship, character assassination, different tools, same motive. Control the narrative before it spreads. That's why Jeanne's story still hums under the skin of modern audiences. It's not about medieval mysticism. It's about the terrifying freedom of believing in something when everyone else wants you to shut up. Faith, at its purest, doesn't negotiate. It doesn't fit into committees or PR campaigns. It just is. And that's exactly what made Jeanne radioactive. She wasn't loyal to the church or the crown. She was loyal to her calling. And institutions hate divided loyalty. The church wanted obedience. The crown wanted control. Jeanne? She wanted truth, or at least her version of it. She didn't see a hierarchy. She saw a mission. To her, they weren't in conflict, but to everyone around her, she was a glitch in the matrix. It's wild to think that the same girl who helped create national unity ended up exposing how fragile that unity really was. The French wanted to believe in divine favor, but only if they could own it. Jeanne's faith couldn't be bought or branded, and that's what made it dangerous. Let's pause here for a second. Think about the last time someone with real conviction scared you, not because they were wrong, but because they were unshakably right in a way you couldn't argue with. That's the discomfort Jeanne caused. She reminded everyone how hollow their faith looked next to hers. The church used Latin. Jeanne used fire. Her life forced people to choose between comfort and conviction, and most chose comfort. They always do, and that's why her story still burns. Because we keep repeating it. Every generation builds its own version of the stake. Sometimes with wood, sometimes with words. Ask Galileo. Ask Rosa Parks. Ask whistleblowers, truth-tellers, artists, and reformers. Different centuries, same pattern. Faith, whether in God, justice, or simple decency, collides with power, and power always reacts the same way. It tries to contain it, but containment never lasts, because faith doesn't die when you burn it. It turns into smoke, rises, and gets into everyone's lungs. It makes people cough, think, and start asking questions. That's what Jeanne did. She infected France with belief, the kind that doesn't obey kings. It's poetic, really. The church wanted to destroy her faith and ended up canonizing it. The king wanted to erase her influence and ended up sitting on a throne built by it. That's the thing about conviction. It always outlives cowardice. And maybe that's why Jeanne's story feels so relevant centuries later. We like to think we've evolved, that we don't burn people for belief anymore. But metaphorically, we still do it all the time. When someone stands too firmly in what they believe, we label them extremist, heretic, zealot, lunatic. We brand them until their humanity burns away and only controversy remains. Jeanne's ashes were literal, ours are digital. But the mechanism hasn't changed. Ridicule the believer until the message loses power. Still, Jeanne's flame refuses to go out. Because at its core, her story isn't about organized religion or patriotism. It's about the cost of conviction. about the lonely courage of standing in front of the world and saying, "This is what I know to be true," even when everyone else is holding matches. Faith and power, two forces that claim to serve the same God but almost never coexist peacefully. Power demands proof, faith demands trust. Jeanne chose trust, and power couldn't forgive that. Her voices might have been angels, or hallucinations, or the echo of her own unstoppable will. Pick your theory. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she believed, and that belief moved empires. The irony is divine. The church burned her for claiming to hear God, then canonized her for it 500 years later. The crown abandoned her, then draped her image in royal processions. Both institutions eventually bowed to the very spirit they tried to kill. Because faith, the kind that refuses to die, always wins in the long game. So next time someone calls Jeanne a saint, remember, she didn't die for holiness. She died for having the audacity to listen when no one else could hear. Maybe that's why her voice still echoes through history. It's not a hymn, it's a warning. Power builds its monuments. Faith lights its fires. And between them, someone always burns. Maybe that's why her story still burns. There's a strange kind of quiet that follows a legend. The flames go out, the shouting fades, the judges die off one by one. And yet, somehow the story keeps talking. Jeanne's voices may have gone silent that day in Rouen, but ours never stopped echoing them. Let's rewind for a second. Past the smoke, past the sainthood, past the centuries of retelling. Forget the myth for just a moment. Picture the real Jeanne. Barefoot in a field, staring at a horizon she can't name, feeling something stir inside her that no one else seems to hear. A whisper, a pulse, a pull toward something bigger than herself. That was her first calling. Not lightning or trumpets or choirs, just a feeling. The quiet insistence that she was meant for something more. And honestly, that's where her story stops being medieval and starts being universal. Because, admit it, we all have our own voices. Maybe they don't speak in divine tones, but they whisper all the same. The voice that says, "Leave this job." The one that says, "You can do better." The one that says, "This isn't who you are anymore." We drown it out with noise, work, screens, distractions, but it's still there, persistent, patient, waiting. Jeanne didn't drown hers out. She listened. That's the difference between ordinary lives and extraordinary ones. Not destiny, but attention. And maybe that's why her story still gets under our skin. It's not because she's a saint or a martyr. It's because she did what most of us won't. She trusted her own voice when everyone else laughed. Think about that. A teenage girl from a forgotten village told kings and bishops that she had orders from heaven, and meant it. She didn't flinch when they sneered. She didn't compromise when they threatened. She didn't wait for permission. She simply said, "God speaks to me," and the world lost its mind. Even now, centuries later, the idea of someone truly listening to their inner conviction feels dangerous. We call it delusion, arrogance, insanity, anything but courage. Because if we admit it's courage, then we're forced to ask ourselves, what truths have we ignored because they were inconvenient? Jeanne didn't have that luxury. Her voices gave her clarity. Terrifying, liberating clarity. And that kind of certainty doesn't make life easier. It makes it unbearable. Because once you've heard your truth, you can't unhear it. You can't go back to pretending. Maybe her voices were divine. Maybe they were her subconscious shaped by faith and trauma. Maybe they were both. But here's what matters. They told her to believe in something pure, and she did. Entirely. Without irony. Without apology. In a world drowning in sarcasm, that kind of sincerity feels revolutionary. Jeanne's story invites a question most of us avoid. What if the voice we ignore is the one thing that could save us? She followed hers, and it led her to both glory and fire. We silence ours, and it leads us to safety and stagnation. Neither path is painless, one just burns slower. But maybe that's what Jeanne teaches best. That faith in God, in yourself, in purpose, isn't supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to transform you. And transformation, as she proved, rarely looks like peace. Let's slow down for a breath. Imagine her in those final moments again. the flames rising, her lips moving in prayer. Did she hear her voices one last time? Or was it just her own courage echoing back at her? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe by then, the voices had become indistinguishable from her own will. And that's the haunting part. She started out obeying something outside herself and ended by embodying it completely. The girl who heard saints became the saint others heard. Every generation since has tried to decode her. Theologians with their Latin, psychologists with their diagnoses, artists with their metaphors. But maybe she doesn't need decoding. Maybe she's the simplest thing in the world, proof that the human spirit, when it listens, can move mountains. Or armies. Or history. You can feel it even now. In protest chants, in whispered prayers, in late-night journal entries where someone writes, "I think I'm meant for more." Those are our voices. They're messy, doubtful, imperfect, but they're ours. Jeanne's echo lives inside them. The world may not burn us at stakes anymore, but it still scorches anyone who refuses to fit the mold. Faith, creativity, conviction, all of it still threatens the same old power structures. Jeanne's fire just changed form, and maybe that's why her legend refuses to die, because her voices never really left. They just changed speakers. So, here's the uncomfortable truth her story leaves us with. She wasn't special because God chose her. She was special because she chose to listen. We all hear something. The question is, will we? Let that linger for a second. The hum of your own thoughts. The quiet under the noise. The tiny, persistent voice asking for something braver. That's the echo of Jeanne la Pucelle. Not in heaven, but in the space between your heartbeat and your fear. And maybe that's what made her dangerous. She believed herself. For 189 years after Jeanne's execution, almost 5 centuries of guilt, politics, and revision, the Vatican finally decided to make it official. The same institution that once branded her a heretic now wanted to call her holy. In 1920, Pope Benedict XV declared Jeanne d'Arc a saint of the Catholic Church. And so, the girl who'd been burned for listening to God was now being worshipped for it. The ceremony was grand, theatrical, the Church's favorite genre. Incense clouds rolled through St. Peter's Basilica like ghostly applause. Thousands gathered to watch as the Pope proclaimed her sanctity. The choir sang. The crowd wept. The irony, presumably, took the day off. France, of course, loved every second of it. By then, Jeanne had evolved from national embarrassment to national treasure. Politicians invoked her name like a password to instant credibility. Priests quoted her. Soldiers saluted her. Artists sculpted her in marble and gold, polishing away the blood and grime until all that remained was light. But sainthood, that's a tricky thing. It doesn't resurrect the person. It repackages them. The real Jeanne had been raw, stubborn, painfully human. The sainted version was sanitized, less inconvenient, more marketable. They took her doubt and turned it into destiny. Her fear became grace. Her defiance became obedience. It was the final transformation, the heretic reborn as holy myth. And yet, it worked, because sainthood, for all its ceremony, isn't about truth. It's about resonance. It's about what a life means after it ends, how it echoes through people who never met her but somehow recognize themselves in her struggle. Jeanne wasn't canonized because she was perfect. She was canonized because she was impossible to ignore. By 1920, the world had survived one world war and was staggering toward another. People were desperate for symbols, for proof that courage still existed somewhere amid the rubble. Jeanne fit perfectly. A young woman who defied all odds, all systems, and all cynicism. She was faith with a pulse. France needed her. The Church needed her. And so, the story came full circle, the burned girl finally crowned in gold. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sainthood doesn't erase suffering. It beautifies it. Behind every halo is a history of pain dressed up as purpose. Jeanne's sainthood turned her suffering into spectacle, a reminder not of her humanity, but of what humanity demands from its heroes. We love our saints, but only once they've stopped asking for anything. The church bells that rang for her in 1920 weren't an apology. They were applause for how well her suffering fit the narrative. Still, there's something hauntingly poetic about the whole thing. The same fire that tried to silence her became the light that canonized her. And maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Maybe sainthood is less about reward and more about resonance. The idea that some souls are too loud for time to muffle. Let's pause there. Picture it. St. Peter's Basilica, gleaming with candlelight, the air thick with incense. The Pope raises his hands and declares her St. Joan of Arc somewhere. 5 centuries of history collapse into one long sigh of irony and redemption. You can almost imagine Jeanne herself, standing invisible in the rafters, watching the spectacle. Would she smile? Would she laugh? Or would she roll her eyes and mutter, "You could have just believed me the first time"? Because the thing about Jeanne is, she never asked for sainthood. She asked for justice. She wanted her king to fight, her people to believe, her God to guide her. She didn't die for glory. She died because truth didn't fit inside the systems that claimed to represent it. And now, those same systems celebrate her. History is full of that kind of irony. Still, beneath the gold and marble, beneath the centuries of myth and marketing, there's something real that refuses to fade. Jeanne's sainthood might have smoothed her edges, but it didn't erase her essence. She remains what she always was, a living contradiction. Faith and rebellion, innocence and fury, silence and thunder. When you strip away the titles, the relics, the sermons, what you're left with is a girl who looked at the world's cruelty and said, "No." That's the kind of holiness the world doesn't know how to handle. Because sainthood isn't about glowing halos or divine visions. It's about courage, the quiet kind, the kind that burns alone in the dark and still refuses to go out. Jeanne's miracle wasn't that she heard voices. It's that she listened to them when it cost everything. And maybe that's why her canonization felt less like an ending and more like a reflection. A mirror held up to humanity, reminding us that conviction will always outlive comfort. So yes, St. Joan of Arc now stands among the blessed. Her statues gleam, her name is chanted in churches, and her feast day comes every May 30th, the anniversary of her death. But don't let the marble fool you. Behind every statue of St. Joan is the ghost of Jeanne, the barefoot farm girl, the rebel, the warrior, the heretic who refused to shut up, the one who didn't wait for the church's approval to talk to God. Her real miracle wasn't divine. It was human. She was a child who refused to shut up when the world told her to. And that's why her fire still flickers. Not in cathedrals or holy relics, but in every soul that's ever dared to say, "I believe," even when the world rolls its eyes. Modern France adores Jeanne d'Arc, or at least the idea of her. The cafés sell macarons under her name, politicians quote her in speeches they don't mean, and tourists pose beside her golden statue in Paris's Place de Pyramids without ever wondering who she really was. They snap a picture, post it online, and move on. Hashtag Jeanne, hashtag vibes. But behind the hashtags in history books lies a quiet irony. France celebrates Joan of Arc, but rarely remembers Jeanne la Pucelle, the saint, the soldier, the symbol. France loves all three. But the girl, the scared, stubborn teenager who smelled of smoke and hay, who prayed until her voice cracked, who wept when she was alone, she's been edited out. Too inconvenient, too fragile, too real. In a way, modern France has turned her into the nation's screensaver. Beautiful, familiar, and utterly silent. Every May, the parades roll through Orleans. Soldiers march, choirs sing, school children wave paper flags with her face printed on them. It's all very patriotic, very polished. A celebration of courage and purity and victory. But under the brass bands and fireworks, there's something hollow, because when you look closely, it feels less like remembrance and more like ritual, a way to keep her safely embalmed in nostalgia. France claims her, but doesn't always listen to her. And maybe that's the saddest part of her story. Not that she was betrayed by kings and burned by priests, but that she's now worshipped by a country that barely understands what she stood for. In her time, Jeanne fought for France's soul, not its politics. She believed the nation could be something sacred, something united by faith and purpose. But centuries later, faith became unfashionable, and purpose became branding. So, the France that once feared her now uses her like an emblem, a logo for courage, detached from the messy humanity that gave it meaning. Let's be honest. Every country loves its heroes dead. They can't argue back. They can't complicate the narrative. Jeanne's story is perfect for that. Just the right blend of tragedy, purity, and patriotism. It makes people feel inspired without having to change anything. But if Jeanne somehow returned today, barefoot, blunt, and on fire with conviction, she wouldn't be marching in the parade. She'd be yelling at the people holding it. Because Jeanne never fought for comfort. She fought for conscience. She wasn't loyal to France as a place. She was loyal to France as a promise. And promises, unlike parades, demand action. Yet here we are, 500 years later, applauding a saint while forgetting her struggle. It's almost poetic. France's bravest daughter turned into its quietest memory. Still, she lingers. Her statue in Paris stands tall, gold leaf glinting against the sky, sword raised high. Pigeons perch on her helmet, indifferent. Tourists walk by without realizing that the woman cast in bronze once defied everything they take for granted: government, gender, religion, reason itself. Sometimes, at dusk, the light hits her face just right, and for a moment, she almost looks alive. Watching, waiting, and maybe that's the point. Jeanne doesn't belong to France anymore. She belongs to the world, or to anyone who's ever felt unheard, unseen, or underestimated. Because her story isn't just French history. It's human nature. The pattern never changes. A voice speaks, the world mocks it, and centuries later, the same world builds a monument to it. Let's take a slow breath and imagine her in today's France. How would she look on the Paris metro? Armor replaced by jeans, banner swapped for a protest sign. Would she still be called crazy? Would people still roll their eyes when she said she believed in something? Probably, but that's why she'd fit right in. Because the world hasn't changed as much as we like to think. And maybe that's what keeps her relevant. Jeanne isn't just France's saint. She's everyone's reminder. A mirror reflecting how quickly conviction turns into myth, and how easily truth becomes decoration. But here's the strange beauty in it all. Even when we forget her words, her presence still stirs something. France might not listen consciously, but somewhere deep in the collective heartbeat of the nation, her defiance still hums. Every time someone stands up for something impossible, every time a voice says no to power and yes to belief, that's her legacy whispering through time. She doesn't need to be remembered perfectly. She just needs to be felt. Because that's the thing about Jeanne. She never belonged to kings or priests or parades. She belonged to faith itself, in all its wild, inconvenient glory. Do we honor her, or just the story that comforts us? Maybe the real tribute isn't in the statues or speeches. Maybe it's in the quiet moments, the small acts of courage, the whispered prayers, the private decisions to do what's right when no one's watching. Those are her true monuments, invisible but eternal. In the end, Jeanne's not forgotten. She's just waiting not for another parade, but for another believer. And maybe, when the world finally remembers her not as France's saint, but as humanity's conscience, she'll stop standing still. Maybe the gold will flake away, the bronze will breathe, and she'll rise once more. Not to save a nation, but to remind it what salvation actually means. It's been nearly 6 centuries since the pyre at Rouen turned to ash. The marketplace has changed. There's a coffee stand now where people sip lattes on their lunch break. But if you stand there long enough and the wind hits just right, you can almost smell the smoke. It's faint, but it's there. Not the scent of firewood or flesh, but something older, conviction that refuses to die. Because that's the thing about Jeanne's story. It doesn't end. It never could. Every time history tries to bury her, she crawls back out through the cracks, soot-covered and defiant, asking the same inconvenient question. Do you still hear me? Her flame, unlike the one that killed her, doesn't consume. It illuminates. Jeanne d'Arc was never just about faith, or war, or France. She was, and still is, the living embodiment of one terrifying truth. That belief is power, and power fears belief more than anything. That's why she's still dangerous. The kings, the priests, the bureaucrats, they thought they'd silenced her. They thought the fire was final. But you can't burn what's already become an idea. Jeanne stopped being a person the moment she refused to recant. She became a force, untidy, uncontainable, inconveniently eternal. And that's why she keeps coming back. Every generation rediscovers her. The believers see faith. The rebels see courage. The skeptics see madness. The artists see poetry. Each of them is right. Each of them is wrong. Because Jeanne isn't one thing. She's a paradox in armor. The saint who swore, the soldier who prayed, the child who terrified men twice her age. She's what happens when purity meets defiance and refuses to apologize for either. Let's slow down for a second. Think about what that means, to believe so fully that you make centuries of power nervous. That's the kind of faith that doesn't age. It evolves. Jeanne's fire shows up wherever someone risks being laughed at for doing the right thing. It burns in classrooms where young girls refuse to stay quiet. It flickers in protests, in prisons, in every whispered, "I won't." It's there in the artist who refuses to sell out, the believer who prays differently, the thinker who challenges the script. You can spot it anywhere the world tries to put out a spark and fails. And here's the best part. Jeanne didn't need her fire to spread. The people watching her burn did that for her. The moment they saw her die without fear, they inhaled the smoke. It filled their lungs, settled in their bones, and stayed there. We've been breathing it ever since. Centuries later, when France was on the brink again, her story resurfaced like a memory the nation couldn't quite shake. Every time the country fractured, they turned to her. Not because she was divine, but because she reminded them that faith, once lit, doesn't ask permission. Even now, in a world built on irony, she remains stubbornly sincere. She's the saint for people who don't believe in saints, the flame that burns in the skeptical, the disillusioned, the exhausted. Because somewhere beneath all our cynicism, we still crave meaning. We still want to believe that one person's voice can matter. Jeanne proved it can. She's the inconvenient miracle. And maybe that's why her story belongs in the dark. Not in churches or classrooms, but in quiet moments. At 2 a.m., when you're lying awake, wondering if your choices mean anything. When the doubt gets loud, that's when her whisper comes back. Listen anyway. Her legacy isn't in marble statues or canonization papers. It's in the act of refusing to give up when everything around you demands it. The fire that burned her body became a metaphor, but not a soft one. It's the fire of persistence, of conscience, of defiance that refuses to die out no matter how many centuries pass. Because truth doesn't age. It just changes shape. Jeanne's truth, her unshakable, terrifying faith, is still out there, flickering in the people who dare to listen to their own impossible voices. She reminds us that conviction, once ignited, doesn't belong to kings or churches or even nations. It belongs to anyone brave enough to carry it. And maybe that's why we can't stop telling her story. We need her, not as a relic, but as a reminder. That belief, when it's real, will always be misunderstood. That courage, when it's pure, will always look a little insane. That light, when it burns too bright, will always make someone reach for a bucket of water. But some fires, they were never meant to go out. So yes, she was burned for listening. But maybe it's time we started listening, too. If you made it this far, congratulations. You've survived medieval politics, divine confusion, and the world's most inconvenient saint. Hit subscribe before history repeats itself. And remember, some fires fade, but the good ones, the brave, stubborn, unreasonable ones, keep the world warm.